Hello and welcome to the week ahead with IG. I'm Angeline Ong, and shortly we'll be joined by IG's chief market analyst Chris Beecham. First, we have tons for investors to digest on the economic front. We start in Japan on Monday with the consumer confidence numbers and the US ISM manufacturing PMI. Also on Tuesday, it becomes quite heavy with data from Australia, the RBA's interest rate decision, Germany retail sales, Eurozone consumer price index, and also the JOLTS job openings data, along with the API crude oil inventories. Midweek, we've got numbers still from Australia. These are the retail sales number, probably quite a good one for the RBA to kind of pick out as well to see whether consumption is still strong despite the high inflation there. Eurozone unemployment rate also in view. And from the US, we have the ADP employment change, manufacturing PMI. This is the non-manufacturing number, I might add, EIA crude oil inventories, and of course, the bull in the room, the Fed interest rate decision. And that central bank action doesn't dissipate. We've got the ECB, we've got China's Caixin manufacturing PMI, trade balance numbers from Germany, and the US trade balance figures, along with initial jobless claims as well. And on Friday, just when you thought there wasn't already enough excitement, we've got the non-farm payrolls, of course, also other opportunities there for traders, German factory orders, industrial production numbers from France, and retail sales numbers from the Eurozone as well. So the week pretty much punctuated by those non-farms and central bank meetings, a Fed rate hike in May, still the odds-on bet. How should investors position themselves ahead of all this, Chris?
It's another busy week, isn't it? And I say that with a degree of weariness after all that's gone on this week in terms of earnings and GDP figures, but the excitement, if you want to call it that, doesn't stop. For traders, I think we're watching a resurgence in the dollar, actually, as the new week looms, the beginning of the month, of course. We do see perhaps further upside, particularly dollar yen. It's an interesting one to watch because you've had that Bank of Japan commentary this morning saying that they were at least scrapping forward guidance, but nothing more. So that's weakened the yen, given the dollar a boost. But generally, this is the one perhaps to watch. You've seen it lurch higher, back above 136. And if we get perhaps a more hawkish Fed next week's meeting, I think that might be enough. And of course, if we get strong payrolls reports, particularly on the wage front, that will be enough to give this dollar once again a bit more of a boost. And for dollar yen, we have seen essentially this recovery. I think we thought dollar yen was poised to turn lower at the beginning of April, and that hasn't been the case. It's held trendline support. And now with this move higher this morning, it is now heading back towards the 200-day moving average, that red line there around 137, and this vital area of resistance around 137.50. So there's a bit of a hurdle for it to break for further upside, but certainly there's a lot next week that could drive the dollar higher if the right words are said by the Fed and if perhaps you get a slightly stronger payrolls reading.
Chris, stay right there. We'll get back to you on corporate stories. It's also going to be equally busy on the corporate front. Let's have a look at the corporate diary for you. This is what we're looking out for in IG. We've got Logitech and Avis budget out with earnings on Monday. And then on Tuesday, it becomes particularly busy with HSBC earnings. Pfizer, Uber Technologies, another one to look out for, out with first quarter numbers, and AMD as well. If you think this week was all about tech, it's particularly heavy on the tech front as well. Next week, we've got Stellantis out with numbers as well, first quarter there. Deutsche Lufthansa and BNP Paribas and Qualcomm all out with quarterly numbers as well. And on Thursday, we don't know why, but it normally ramps up on a Thursday. Next is out with the first quarter trading statement. Then we've got Shell, Volkswagen, Apple, that's a big one for us, Lyft, first quarter earnings. And on Friday, it gets a bit quieter, but we still have IAG, Adidas, and Air France KLM that might make headlines and opportunities for our investors out there. Apple, a key one to look out for, Chris. On the one hand, some investors think that the COVID curbs, the impact of that, and the China reopening, which has been rather slow compared to what investors were looking out for, is still playing through this stock. Some say the impact of COVID and all this is behind Apple.
To an extent, I suppose, yes. I would, as we look into earnings next week, it's interesting that Apple perhaps are slightly behind the pack in terms of reporting earnings, but still a key one to watch. But there's this huge recovery for Apple, which began right at the beginning of this year. We were down at 123, and we're now up 35% since then. So an impressive gain, which of course means a lot of good news is now priced in to Apple, where it wasn't, I think, before. Nonetheless, of course, it looks like a brighter outlook. Consumer spending has held up generally around the world better than many people feared. Certainly, as you mentioned, China reopening, that surge coming back in again. So demand for smartphones and for Apple smartphones, which are not the cheapest in the world, still seems to be strong. So I think this is putting Apple in a good place. And if you're looking at from a technical perspective as well, you've now started to finally see we've got some trend line resistance coming through from all the way back in January of 2022, which held back gains back in March and then into August of last year. So this huge rebound has carried us right back there. We finally managed actually a close above that trend line as we wrap up this week and move towards earnings next week. That's definitely the area to watch, really. Could give you perhaps argument for a bullish move to the upside with a stop potentially down below this week's lows, down at 162. So definitely something to watch there. Apple, a key one for the week, although it might struggle to get the attention it deserves, given the fact it'll come the day after the Fed and a day before non-farm payrolls.
Thanks very much, Chris. We have to leave it there. Apple also, interestingly enough, has just recently opened its first Apple store in India. Interesting, given it coincides with UN data showing that India is likely to surpass China as the world's most populous nation by the middle of this year. And that's the latest from us. Do tune in for more charting and trading the trend shows. Until then, have a good weekend. I'm Angeline Ong, and this is IGTV.